Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about what is the difference between a modernist and a neo-modernist. Then we're going to transition to talking about modernist apologetics, because Pope Pius X did devote a pretty lengthy section to his encyclical Pascendi on modernist apologetics. He did not devote a section to neo-modernism, because neo-modernism is new modernism, and that didn't really arise until the time just before the council, in sort of the post-war period. So we have to look at that in light of modernism and see how the tactics have changed. We're going to discuss that as we go here. You're going to want to stay tuned. All right, welcome back to another edition of Mere Tradition. We're continuing with our series of what happened to Catholicism. So far, we've covered the philosophical history, or the historical philosophers behind modernism. We studied what their philosophies were. We've studied how those things were picked up by theologians in the church. We've studied the effects of modernism on authority in the church, how modernists deal with the Bible, and a host of other things. So if you're not caught up, you might want to check the other episodes. You can find them on this YouTube channel if you're watching there. Or the easiest way is to go to my Substack, which is linked underneath if you're not already on Substack. And there's a whole section devoted to them, like a playlist, if you just scroll down on that main page. And okay, as I said, today we're going to be talking about modernism and neo-modernism, because it's important to understand neo-modernism and how it relates to modernist apologetics, which Pius X did warn of. But as neo-modernism has become the new modernism, it's going to look a little bit different, even if very similar to what Pius X said. Now, before we continue, I want to just remind you of the Canadian Martyrs Men's Conference, where there will be no modernism or neo-modernism allowed. Excuse me. February 7th and 8th, fast approaching. You can find the links for this in the description area. Keynote speaker, Father Marcel Stannis and Father Yves Leroux, who is the District Superior of Canada, and my friend Al Smith will be giving a talk, as will I. The theme for this year is the Kingship of Christ, and you're not going to want to miss it. It's a great conference. I believe there are other traditional Catholic men's conferences now in North America. We were the first. So come to the OG TradCat Men's Conference. Links for that in the description area. All right, so let's break this down. So modernism is the heresy that Pius XII defined, which we've been talking about at length in this series. And it's the topic of my forthcoming book, What Happened to Catholicism, which will be out, I think it's April 15th. It was supposed to be in March, but we've delayed a little bit. That's always what happens in publishing. You can find that book at Sophia. You know what? I'll put a link underneath. You can actually buy pre-orders. So check that out. And that's coming out in April. But in any event, modernism is the heresy Pope Pius X defined. And we've been going through the encyclical Pascendi by Pope Pius X, which is on the doctrines of the modernists. Modernism is basically a combination, well, it's a synthesis of all heresies, as Pius X said, but it's basically, you take the combination of modern philosophies and you rethink Catholicism through that, more or less. And because modern philosophies are kind of completely antithetical to the perennial wisdom of the church and of basically what we might call the inherited, received tradition from antiquity, whether it be Platonic or Aristotelian or Socratic or anything. And, excuse me, it's against basically the perennial wisdom of what we today call Western civilization. It's the new way of thinking that is rationalist, materialist, subjectivist, evolutionist, agnostic, and so forth. And it applies that to religion, and we get a rethought Catholicism. And that's why it was called modernism, is because it was something that arose in modern times. It doesn't mean everything that's modern is bad. It just means that it arose in modern times. Just like there's a heresy of Americanism. It doesn't mean to be American is to be a heretic. It means it arose as an American idea, basically. So what is neo-modernism? Well, neo-modernism is modernism reinvented. So a little bit of history. Modernism is condemned in 1907 by Pius X. And like all papal condemnations, it was very strong. It was received. It was the official line of the church. And the modernists themselves, some of them were excommunicated explicitly. And the rest of them sort of took notice. But then 7 years later, something really tragic happened. The First World War commenced. And one of the main reasons why modernism had been spreading is because remember, if he's writing an encyclical on this in 1907, there's already a problem. And it's dating back at least half a century. And the reason that was happening is largely because in this post-revolutionary age, think French Revolution as the major revolution in Europe that really shakes up the foundations of Christendom, which was not fully intact after the Protestant Reformation, but nonetheless there was a great stability. And this major revolutionary age, revolutions in France, then revolutions in Latin America, which was really like revolutions in Spain, if you think about it, and revolutions in all other Western European countries come in the mid to late 1800s, more or less. Education is radically changed because a lot of it is taken control of by the state, and that's not a bad thing if the state is explicitly Catholic and the church is given the freedom to basically make the education so. But now we have these non-Catholic states, or in many cases anti-Catholic states, in charge of education. You can see how the problems would arise from that. Anything but Catholicism is the truth in schools, which is like today. And the governments also are no longer supportive. They become adversarial to Catholicism and so forth. While Pius X hammers home the Catholic truth, and he was very hard on certain governments, especially the French government, very hard on it. And he would not budge. And he was having good success. It was a battle. He was having some good success. At least Catholics knew that their Pope was their guy. At least they knew that their Pope, whatever the state may ask of you, etc., the Pope would be coming with guns blazing saying, no, Catholicism isn't like that. No, Catholics don't believe that. So even if your kids, for example, were going to a state school because they were required to by law or something, and there may have been anti-Catholic propaganda, the zeitgeist in the officialdom of the church was against that secular zeitgeist. So the kids were formed. It's kind of like, if you can't homeschool or send your kids to a really good private school, which is sometimes the case, and people in that situation need to be given a little bit more leeway. This isn't the first time in history this has happened. I mean, people in the 1800s and 1900s who were immigrants moving to different countries and, whatever, moving to America from Italy or Germany or wherever where they were strong Catholics, and they're putting their kids in these American public schools, which weren't obviously as insane and woke as today, but they were surely imbibed with anti-Catholicism. And they couldn't homeschool their kids, and if they couldn't send their kids to a private Catholic school, it just wasn't in the cards. So if that situation arises, you have to deal with it. And for some people, it does happen, and they shouldn't be blamed for it. But you do your best in those situations to really form your kids, and the parishes step in, and they really form the kids. They have more than just like the 2-week thing to get your confirmation. It's like there is Sunday school and catechism class and youth formation and church camps and all these things where, the primary factor in your life is the religion, and those kids go to school equipped. Okay, well, that was happening on a universal scale, if we might say it like that. Even if the governments and the state education systems were against the church, the Catholics were hearing that from the pulpit. They were reading these letters from Pius X or whatever if they're in France, and it's like, the church says our government is wrong and they're heretics, so we're not to listen to their nonsense. I'm obviously simplifying, but things like that were going on. So the situation wasn't perfect, but there was this healthy adversarial relationship. And I say healthy in the sense of it was normal and it should have been that way. There was this healthy adversarial relationship between the church and the godless states. And the Catholics knew that, which gave them a little attaboy, a little motivation. The problem is, the First World War comes and everything is destroyed. Pope Pius X dies. Benedict XV comes in, doesn't do a whole lot. He finishes the Code of Canon Law, which people can debate about whether or not that was even good, but that's another story. Then we have Pope Pius XI, who was great. But Pope Pius XI, and he made some mistakes, especially with Mexico and with Action Française in France. But Pius XI comes along, and he's got a lot of that old school Pius X in him. And he wrote a ton of great documents. But we're dealing with the interwar period now, so like massive communist revolutions and Roaring '20s, Great Depression, just massive social upheaval, societies that are completely destroyed and rebuilding themselves. It's extremely chaotic. Then the First World War comes around after the Depression. That brings even more destruction. And by that time, it was kind of a war of attrition. And, so many hundreds of millions of people were displaced and killed, and then, including both statistical categories. And then obviously oodles and oodles of people are killed and societies destroyed and borders redrawn and so forth. And the zeitgeist just majorly changed. Pius XII was very orthodox. He wrote very good documents, but he wasn't able to sway governments and things like that to do as much as was possible by his predecessors, because the institutions were, many of them, so new and so radical and not attached. They didn't respect the authority and whatnot. They just didn't care. And it was the dawn of the technological media age. Televisions were becoming more common, radios in every home, etc. And it was just an avalanche against traditional Christendom, basically. And it was a recipe for disaster. In that time of that war period and post-war period is when the modernists, who had been hanging around but under the surface, this is when they reemerged. And they gave us what we would call neo-modernism. And this neo-modernism was just modernism with a more pacified approach. And I cite this in my forthcoming book, What Happened to Catholicism. I can't remember exactly where it was. It's many hundreds, it's many, many thousands of words, and I'm not remembering exactly where in the manuscript the quote is. But I cite various authors from the 20s and 30s saying how they were very intentional, that they would find a way to pacify the presentation of modernism so that you wouldn't fall under condemnation. And how do you do this? Well, you basically say the same things. So the modernists believe that doctrine evolves, meaning doctrine itself changes. And you say that in a way that doesn't actually get you in trouble, because you can't actually say that. In fact, I'll read something here. This was a condemnation from the Holy Office in 1904. And this was a proposition condemned by the Holy Office. And this was the statement that was condemned. So I'm just going to read what the neo-modernists would say, but this is condemnatory. And this is from the 20s, so you can see this is still happening. And the statement is, even after faith has been received, man ought not to rest in the dogmas of religion and hold fast to them fixedly and immovably, but always solicitous to remain moving ahead toward a deeper truth and even evolving into new notions and even correcting that which he believes. So that's a condemned statement. And you can see here how this is modernist, but not explicitly. Because I'll read it again. Even after faith has been received. So they're right about that. So they don't say faith is from inside. The modernists are explicit that faith is from inside. The neo-modernist is talking about faith in a more orthodox sense. Because remember, it's not modernism, it's the new modernism, so it's repackaged. He says, this is the neo-modernist speaking, even after faith has been received, man ought not to rest in the dogmas of religion and hold fast to them fixedly and immovably. That statement is kind of heretical, kind of ambiguous. They don't say that you should deny the dogmas. They're saying not rest in them, because but always solicitous to remain moving ahead toward a deeper truth and even evolving into new notions and even correcting that which he believes. So nowhere in that statement does it say evolving into new dogmas. Nowhere in that statement does it say evolving into new doctrines. Nowhere in that statement does it say the faith evolves. And nowhere in that statement does it say you should deny the faith. But this statement was condemned as heretical. Why? Because of what it says when you take it as a whole. It says when you take it as a whole that you shouldn't rest in the dogma and hold fast to them fixedly and immovably, but you should always be moving toward a deeper truth and evolving notions and correcting that which he believes. If you read that as a regular person and not an academic, if you read that as a regular person, if your priest preaches this to you from the pulpit, you say, he just told us that the dogmas aren't fixed and they change into new ones. That's what that means, obviously, for a common sense person. And at the time of that era of the Holy Office, there were men in the Holy Office who had their wits about them. And they knew what was being said without fully saying it in the most explicit way possible. The modernists of Pius X's age would say things like, dogma evolves into new dogmas. The modernists the modernists become the neo-modernists after the First World War. And they say things like, don't be too rigid, don't stay in your fixed immovableness, but go towards new notions and deeper understandings. And then when someone comes at them, they can say, hey, I didn't say new dogmas, I just meant new notions. They're just cheating with words because we all know what that means. This is just one example, but this was something that was common. And you find this mentality in the work of Cardinal Ratzinger, and I'll read something else here. And he wrote, I was of the opinion that scholastic theology, as it had firmly been settled, change that with fixed and immovable, is no longer a means fit to bring the faith into the language of the time. And I didn't want to operate only in a stagnant and closed philosophy, but in a philosophy understood as a question, what is man really? And particularly to enter into the new contemporary philosophy. So when he talks about scholastic theology, he's talking about Thomas Aquinas and whatnot. And he's saying that that really wasn't good for us anymore. We had to move on to something new that would give us new ideas. There's nothing heretical that Ratzinger says there. But the sentiment behind it is the same thing we find in the condemned statements from the Holy Office. And this is just one example I have in my book. And I cite Garrigou-Lagrange in my work, who was a master Thomist of the 20th century, arguably the best. And he was, in one of his books, he warned that this new approach, which he called the New Theology, you've probably heard of the New Theology, he said it was modernism in thought as in action. And he said a colleague had told him, one of his academic colleagues, those who have attempted to attend the classes of the masters of modernist thought in order to convert them have allowed themselves to be converted by them. Little by little, they come to accept their ideas, their methods, their disdain of scholasticism, their historicism, their idealism, and all of their errors. And this is going to lead us to, we're going to have to discuss here the New Theology. And this is going to, well, I don't know who's going to watch this. This is going to tick some people off because many of the contemporary figures of our day who are conservative Catholic figures love the New Theology. Well, here's the thing. At the beginning, the New Theology was not something that the popes were into. And here's what Pius XII wrote. And he wrote this in 1946, speaking to the electors of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, at their general congregation called to elect a new superior general. And this was in an address where he spoke of his concerns about trends in modern thought that had infiltrated into the Jesuits, who had for so many centuries until then been the guardians of orthodoxy. Among other things, he said to them, he wrote this, he said, "That which is immutable, let no one disturb it or change it." So none of this not resting in fixed things. You're supposed to do that. He continues, "Much has been said, but not enough after due consideration about the," and he writes this word in French, "nouvelle théologie, which because of its characteristic of moving along with everything in a state of perpetual motion," which sounds just like the condemned statement from the Holy Office, "will always be on the road to somewhere but will never arrive anywhere. If one thought that one had to agree with an idea like that, what would become of Catholic dogmas, which must never change? What would happen to the unity and the stability of the faith?" There was a very respected Thomist at the time of Pius XII, and his name was Father Greenstock. He was David Greenstock. He was a very well-known American priest. And he wrote about this new theology, which they all considered to be new modernism, neo-modernism. And he said, "The main contention of the partisans of this new movement is that the theology, to remain alive, must move with the times, and that traditional theology is out of touch with reality." This is the vital imminence of modernism. This is the continual evolution. And Greenstock showed that at the heart of the new theology is a mentality that is ultimately unhistorical. He wrote the following. He said, "According to such teachers, and he's talking about new theologians who were considered to be modernists. According to such teachers, traditional theology with its foundations in Aristotelianism has lost, during the centuries which followed St. Thomas Aquinas, a mass of notions, ideas, and even methods expounding the faith which were well known to the fathers of the Church, some of which have been taken over by the leaders of contemporary non-Catholic thought." So non-Catholic philosophy is going to give us the key to understanding Catholicism, because what was truly Catholic has been lost. That's what he's saying. He continues, "Such ideas and methods must be recovered." What is that? What do we call that today? That's the ressourcement. That's the idea of going back to the sources to find out what they were actually saying. This is all the rage since Vatican II. "Such ideas and methods must be recovered if any approach is to be made to the modern world." So we have to go back to the time before the official theologians of the Church screwed it all up. He continues, "And they must be incorporated into theology, even if that means rejecting Aristotelianism or even Thomism as we understand it today. So we need a new Thomism. We need a new philosophy. We need modern philosophy." Now, the assertion here, if you think about it, is actually kind of crazy. The progenitors of the new theology this was written in the 1940s. They basically were saying the true Thomism had been lost. The Church's theologians have ignored the great richness of Catholic thought that is to be found in the Fathers. And because of this, the Church cannot relate to modern men who understand things better with modern philosophy. Now that's quite the assertion, isn't it? All the popes and councils, theologians, saints who exalted Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic method for centuries and centuries were, according to the new theologians, woefully ignorant of a massive profundity of Catholic thought somehow lost to history. Have you ever heard, for example, of the Protestant notion of the Great Apostasy? There's many versions of it, but in general, and often it centers around Constantine. Basically, there was this pure Christian church in the first 2 or 3 centuries Then Christianity is officialized and made legal by the state. This is why they hate state Christianity. This is why they're liberals, because they believe that. Anyway, we've talked about that. They hate state Christianity because they believe basically what happens is there's this pure Christian church where we need to go back to that. Early church, early church, early church. And then from the officialization of Catholicism or Christianity, which was never called Catholicism, it was Christianity in the minds of these people. Or if it was Catholicism, it wasn't Roman Catholicism, because with the official Catholicism of the Roman Empire comes a perverted Christianity where the true Christianity was lost. That's what many Protestants believe. It's obviously absurd, and it begs the question why God would allow 12 centuries to pass from Constantine to Luther, where Christians were just groping around in the dark and just being damned to hell left, right, and center because they were in this fake Christianity and whatever. Martin Luther was the prophet who figured it out. Fine. It's really absurd, but that's what many believe. They believe some version of it. This is super common in every heresy. The Mormons have ideas like this. All of the heretics have ideas like this. Muslims have ideas like this. They call us people of the book, but we have the bad version of the book because it was perverted and stuff. And then Muhammad comes along and he gives us the pure one, which had been lost. It's not 12 centuries later, but it's 3 or 4 centuries later. It's still a long time later. Well, 3 or 4 centuries since Constantine. I don't know when they would ascribe the perversion happening, but the point is that all heresies have this idea. And same, likewise, with this new theology that was arising, you have this notion that we have to go back to the beginning because at a certain point we screwed it all up. And let us guide you to the true Christianity that we find in this distant past. And very conveniently, we will use our methods to do so, which are modern, because we have deemed those the best to look at things because of our historical sciences, which those primitive medievals did not have, which is why they were so ignorant. It's the same thing. Now, you can gussy it up all you'd like. You can make it sound smarter than that, but that's what the idea is at root. And this is what was going on at the time. And I'll give you an example of Father Greenstock again talking about how the new theology approaches divine revelation, and it's going to sound a lot like modernism. This is what he writes, as they would say. When God speaks to man and communicates to him divine mysteries, it is the fact which is revealed and not the logical proposition in which that fact is presented to us. So it's the kernel of the idea, but not exactly the words. So it's not that God created the world out of nothing the way Genesis says. It's that he's the creator, and that's what's important. Consequently, this is Greenstock continuing, very different philosophical systems can and indeed should be used to express that divine revelation and to explain it to the people for whom it is intended. So as people change, the way we talk about doctrine should change. People don't conform to religion. We conform religion to people. And this is because, according to the new theologians, people aren't theologians. So we got to change it to their language. Just like we have to change the mass to the language of the people, because they're not linguists. We can't expect them to learn what any 7-year-old who attends an SSPX chapel can learn. That's not reasonable. He continues, the supernatural virtue of faith, which is given to us by God, in order that we may believe the truths which he has revealed, is essentially a vital thing, vital immanence. A part, that is to say, of our lives, and as such it cannot be separated from the age in which we live. So we're a child of the age no matter what we want, because of evolution. This is the other principle. So we have vitality, vital immanence, and evolution, right? Both modernist principles. Only in a very secondary way is it concerned with those formal propositions under whose form the faith is presented to us. So the definitions are secondary. We talked about this in an earlier episode about how modernists define tradition. Faith will thus give birth to theology, because the truths of faith are expressed in words and concepts from philosophical systems. But since those philosophies will naturally tend to evolve according to the needs of the times, it follows that theology too will be in a state of constant evolution. This is what the new theologians were writing in the 40s. This is modernism. However, the real progress in the development of revealed truth is to be found not in the use of philosophical terms or logical propositions and reasonings, but in an ever-growing penetration into the truths of faith by a deeper and more vital Christian life. He's describing modernism. He continues, since the life of the individual as a Christian and a member of the mystical body cannot be separated from the age in which he lives, it will be natural and even necessary to adopt the terms and the concepts familiar to modern thought in order to express the truths of faith in such a way that they will be intelligible and attractive to those outside the true church who are groping their way towards the knowledge and the love of God. Simply put, this new theology Father Greenstock is talking about in the 40s and 50s, which Pius XII said he was very concerned about, this is nothing more than the modernism condemned by Pius X that we have discussed in this series. So there you go. Now, we are going to go behind a paywall while I talk about modernism and apologetics. I'm not going behind a paywall to bash other apologists. It's just that this is a series that's overall for premium subscribers. So if you want to see the whole of it, join us on the other side. The link for how to do that will be in the description if you're listening to the free preview. I'll see you on the other side.